Welcome to our colloquium today, November 2nd. Today we are lucky to have Professor Margaret O'Mara from the history at the University of Washington here to talk to us about the internet economy. She is the Howard and Frances Keller Endowed Professor of History here at UW. She writes and teaches about the growth of the high-tech economy, which is highly relevant to all of us as electrical and computer engineers. She also writes about the history of US politics and the connections between the two. Professor O'Mara is the author of The Cities of Knowledge, Pivotal Tuesdays, and The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. She is a co-author with David Kennedy and Elizabeth Cohen of forthcoming editions of the widely used college history textbook, The American Pageant. And she's also a frequent contributor to the opinion page of the New York Times, and her writing has also appeared in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, Bloomberg, Businessweek, Foreign Policy, The American Prospect, and Pacific Standard. So with that, I hope that you enjoyed today's colloquium. And Professor O'Mara, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Denise. And thank you, Shruti, Emily, and everyone else who made this possible. It's great to be here with you guys. I'm thrilled to talk. And so what I'm going to do without further ado is I will share my screen. I have some pictures to show you. Okay, I hope everyone sees my title. And so this is the title of the talk today, and information wants to be free, and this is this quote, this information wants to be free is a kind of widely used, widely kind of quipped, and its origins are with Stuart Brand, who's someone you might have heard of, the creator, among other things, of the Whole Earth Catalog, a thinker, visionary, the ultimate hacker. In fact, he said this at the Hackers Conference in 1984. This kind of iconic moment in computer science and engineering. That is very much a kind of someone who's had a significant role in kind of articulating the techno-optimistic vision of the internet era. And someone who continues to be very active today. And so information wants to be free. This is something that was, this is something that's bandied about, this phrase is bandied about when people are talking about net neutrality or talking about a kind of internet that's, either uncoupled from the for-profit platform economy, or as a rationale for why these platforms should not have constraints on what people say on them, and the platforms should not be held liable for what people say, and that having more information, more connectivity, more speech on the internet is a good thing. But like a lot of things, sometimes these catchphrases are taken out of context. So what I wanted to do as I start off here is to give a little context. This is what historians do. We give context and complexity and contingency. So this is what Stuart Brand said, and he said this in the context of a discussion going on at the Hackers Conference, kind of ad hoc, about one of the perennial debates, battles in the tech industry, which is, should software be proprietary or should it be free and widely distributed? Open source versus licensing, the cathedral and the bazaar, Bill Gates versus homebrew, that kind of dyad of what do we do? And so he's really just kind of he's riffing here and being observational. So he's saying, on the one hand, information wants to be expensive because it's so valuable. The right information, the right hands can, at the right time, can change your life. On the other hand, information wants to be free because the cost of getting it out is lower and lower all the time. So you have the two fighting against each other. So this is kind of an interesting kind of bigger picture than just saying, hey, we need to let the internet should be a free space for free speech and conversation and open and unregulated and unfettered and not adhering to the rules and, breaking boundaries and breaking rules. He's sort of saying more, and even though, Brand is a a good one, maybe one of the OG techno libertarians, he is, sort of observing here that there really is this tension between, you could say in one way, the tension between making a profit and capitalizing on the internet as a platform and as a means of platform for communications, commerce, and everything else, or whether it should be something that is a public utility, something that is regulated and open and not controlled by for-profit companies. So this is a really relevant, relevant debate right now. This is, here we are at the moment where we have a few very, very wealthy, powerful platform companies, Facebook/Meta being one of them, that have the resources and are sort of taking it upon themselves to articulate a vision about what the future of the internet, certainly the consumer-facing internet, is going to look like. Now, I say this, as we all know, and I'm sure you guys are well aware, there are many technologists and academics who are also thinking about what the future of the web and the future of computing is going to look like. This is not just, sometimes the media will focus relentlessly on 5 big companies and not recognize that there's a broader field. But it's clear that what we have right now is this rather unusual situation in which there are a few very large platform companies that, among other things, have been using their copious resources. I mean, they have so much money, and they've been hiring up talented academic engineers, data scientists, et al., to come over and help them build the future. So this question of kind of information wanting to be free, like whose information, on what platform does that information occur, and the tension, the conversation that's emerging now in the United States and also in the EU in particular, is what role should government play, and is the government how should the internet economy be regulated? So what I want to talk about today is, what I do is I give the backstory to how we got to now, in a lot of things. And so what I want to do today is give the backstory of how we got to here, how we got to an internet economy that is where this debate over whose internet and how much speech, what kind of speech should be allowed, and who's putting the guardrails on that speech, who's responsible for it, who are the regulators, is it the self-regulation of the private companies, which has been the status quo? Like, how did we get to that? Or should it be governments? And what's the pro and con of government? We're debating now, there's a proposal in the Senate to create, a kind of essentially government regulation of health misinformation, which, on the one hand, you could say, well, that's good. We've had all this disinformation on the internet. We need to do something about, to make sure there's accurate information. And you could also say, well, if it depends on who the government is and who's determining what's good information and what's bad. So these are all very live questions. And obviously a lot of us at UW are thinking about this and contributing to that conversation. So where does the history start? Where do we begin? How do we get to the roots of how we got this internet economy and the conditions we're operating under now? Well, let's go way back. It's not just Mark Zuckerberg. It's not Steve Jobs. It goes even further back. Let me start here with who wasn't even the start, but one starting place could be Dwight Eisenhower and his missile cone in the Oval Office. So in the early Cold War, the question of there's an immense amount of money that's going into, among other things, small electronics and communication devices. These are the building blocks for the computer revolution to come and the building blocks for the networked computing revolution to come. Why is the US government spending so much money on advanced electronics, small electronics, and communication devices? Well, because the US is very concerned about sending things into space or preventing things from the outer atmosphere, i.e. missiles, from coming down to Earth and destroying American cities. And so the question of missile defense, both the sort of missile and rocket capacity and defense against enemy incoming missiles from the enemy have been priorities of the US military from the Second World War forward. And a great deal of research money, as many of you all are well aware, goes into disciplines like electrical engineering and engineering generally, and physics, and the emerging, what later becomes the sort of singularly defined discipline of computer science, which is, as of 1957, isn't yet officially its own standalone discipline. So the 57 is an important turning point, because 1957 in October October 1957 is the month that the Soviets beat the US into orbit for the first time with the Sputnik satellite. This is a huge black eye for the US that has been, working very hard and investing quite a great deal of money in technologies to send a rocket into orbit, to send to satellite technology, and anything. And there is a robust space program already. But Sputnik, the fact that the Russians get there first, the US got there about 4 months later, but still, it's a big black eye in the middle of the Cold War. Prompts the US to shovel even more money into small advanced electronics and communications devices. And this is about this is not just about sending astronauts or dog astronauts into space. This is also, if the Soviets can put Sputnik, a satellite, into orbit, that means they have the capacity for intercontinental ballistic missile technology. That was the kind of where the Eisenhower administration quickly went. So rockets and missiles are very, it's the same stuff. It's very closely tied. We think about the space program, we think about the right stuff and Chuck Yeager and the astronauts, and it is something separate from the Cold War, but it was a Cold War program. It was very much all connected too. And these technologies are, again, like, investing so much money in all this is creating the foundation for the commercial internet-driven industry that we have today. Like, we would not have this without all of this money being spent in the 50s and 60s. It's why the US became so dominant in the field and continues to be. So one thing that comes out of this big wave of spending after Sputnik is the creation of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency. So you all may have heard of DARPA. They fund all sorts of cool blue sky research to this day. They are a major funder of academic research, basic research, and have really been, a kind of very, very significant research agency in the constellation of research agencies in advancing computer science and engineering, electrical engineering more broadly. So DARPA is, which originally was called ARPA, was established in 1958, a few months after Sputnik. So this is all kind of the response to this, the Soviets getting into orbit first. And this becomes this really, this incubator for all sorts of interesting projects. And as you may be aware, this is the place that puts money in to create the first computer network infrastructure, the ARPANET. The ARPANET comes online in 1969. These are the first nodes of the ARPANET. And the ARPANET is, so this is not the first time the US government has started playing around and investing in computer networking infrastructure. It's, you might be familiar with the SAGE system, the semi-automatic ground environment, which was a missile defense system that was essentially prototypically kind of allowing computers to talk to one another to create a network for missile defense. This is something that starts getting developed in the early 1950s and is perhaps the first example of this networking. And there already was, computer networking preceded the ARPANET, the idea that you have, people in different locations that are connecting computers, connecting to the same computer is something that is quite common by the late 60s when the ARPANET comes online. You have time sharing. So this is the age of the mainframe computers, right? So these giant room-sized things. The mini computers are just starting to come online. Mini computers were like the size of a refrigerator. So there's nothing really mini about them in the way that we think about computing. But here's a dorm at Radcliffe in the 1960s. So college students were some of the early adopters and first exposed to this new mode of getting computer time, where you have a teletype machine and you're connected, not through the internet, that doesn't exist yet, but through a phone line to a mainframe computer, and you're able to use some of the computing power, take turns using the computing power that's centrally located in a different location. And there were a few very lucky high school students who got to tap into university-based computers. Here's Paul Allen and Bill Gates at Lakeside School in 1968. Lakeside was unusual in that its high school had a computer, and it had a computer lab, and it connected to a mainframe that was here at the UW. So this early exposure, you have this generation, a baby boom generation, broadly defined, that is getting exposed to computing through this networked infrastructure, right? They may not be of the age and stage or have the credentials to kind of get in the computer lab and work directly on the computers themselves, but now you have a way for computing to be more democratized, so to speak. So this is the way that time sharing was something that was pretty common by the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, which was you have, and it was really a hub and spoke mechanism, right? So you have a main computer, and then you have all of these peripheral, teletype machines plugging into it. So you have people at different locations plugging into it and sharing time on the same computer. Now, this hub and spoke system is very different from what the ARPANET is. So let me go back to our little map of the ARPANET. So the ARPANET is different in that it is, for one, it's designed by academics. So it was funded by the Defense Department, but the military brass had nothing to do with its design at all. They left it in the hands of the computer scientists and the engineers, which their design for it was quite different. They wanted to find a way to have not a hub and spoke where you have a central most important computer and everyone's feeding into it. These are all university labs that have their own powerful computers. They have their own supercomputers, or almost super, not quite super then yet, but powerful computers. And they wanted to find a way for those computers to communicate with one another, which was different than time sharing, which was hub and spoke, where different users are using the same machine. These are different machines communicating. And this again is something that academic engineers have been tackling for some time, thinking about how computer communication can kind of take everything to the next level, right? This is something that has been sort of turned over and thought through and theorized for several years before the ARPANET comes online. But the ARPANET is the first real demonstration of it at scale, and it has defense money behind it. So it is has a little more money to play with and to burn. So this is the very beginning, and notice this is, it's not on the East Coast, it's not at the Pentagon, it's at these university or university affiliated labs that are all federally funded. So you have University of Utah, you have UCLA, UCSB, and Stanford Research Institute, SRI, which had just kind of spun off from Stanford itself. And so that's how it begins. So it's non-hierarchical. So instead of a hub and a spoke, you have different, it's the internet we know. It's a web. It's a web. So there's not one single node. Now there was some appeal. There's sort of a legend about the internet that it was all about, the military designed military defense. Yes and no, right? So I've already talked about how the US military is obsessed with missile defense for quite some time, and this becomes the rationale for computer communication, investment in computer communication. But the ARPANET was not necessarily kind of designed to be a defense system, even though it was funded by the defense. It was really designed as an academic research tool. But there was an appeal to the non-hierarchical design that definitely was in sync with what military planners were concerned about, which is if you have a hub and you have spokes, and if the hub is knocked out by, a missile coming over from the Soviet Union, then you're messed up. So this idea of playing around with non-hierarchical communication networks had a resonance with what the Defense Department was looking for, even though it sort of to say this is why it was the way it was mostly the way it was because it's a bunch of like long-haired academics who were like, let's just, no one's in charge. We're all collaborators. So that sort of philosophy was very much animating the internet's design. And of course, it becomes really critical to understanding how and why it was able to set such an effective backbone for the economy that we have. Okay, so let's move into the sort of where we go from next. So let's go back to, we're still in this world of time sharing. So the ARPANET comes online in 1969. More and more nodes get added over the course of the 70s. You have, protocols, all the sort of familiar, some of the, the first emails start to be sent on the ARPANET. You have things that are later become very familiar hallmarks of the internet world we live in are kind of playing out on the ARPANET. But it still is a really limited world. To be on the ARPANET, you have to be a government-funded academic, essentially, or you have to be in the Pentagon. Like there's very, very limited world of people who are on it. It's not a consumer facing, it's not commercial, it's nothing. It's just its own walled garden that's developing. And meanwhile, you have this baby boom generation that has gotten turned on to computing and is really and hates the fact that computers are basically all residing in the back offices of big business, big government agencies, big universities, the establishment. And so this is the seeds of the personal computing and personal computer networking movement, which is saying we need to take the computer power away from the man and let's create different. Oh, sorry, my watch thought I was talking to it. It started talking to me. The computer power. So let's take the computer power away from the man and let's put it in our hands and let's create our own net. Let's take this basic networking technology that we're using for time sharing and let's figure out ways for communication to happen with one another over computers. So there are these prototypical like new sort of bulletin boards and ways for sort of communication that are kind of prototypes of the later, will kind of later give birth to the BBSs, the Usenet, these early bulletin board communication services. And then later, in the internet era, we have chat groups and chat rooms and instant messaging and all these other and social networking and all the things that we're more familiar with. But the beginnings of it kind of come from this very idealistic notion that's taking root in places like Berkeley. Here's, this is community memory, which was a kind of publicly available teletype terminal where you could kind of send messages to one another on the network and people could come in and post like, oh, I have, I'm selling a couch. It was kind of like early Craigslist. It was not, not trying to necessarily change the world, but something that was playing around with this idea that having communication by computer would open things up and make things and kind of advance the broader goals of the 1960s anti-war movement and this new generation that's thinking about ways to push against the gatekeepers and the institutions and find new ways to communicate, collaborate, exchange goods that was not under control of these big business or big government. So this is the sort of the personal computer and networking industries really have their roots in this pretty idealistic, very techno-optimistic movement that comes out of the 1960s that is thinking about computers as tools for liberation. And Stuart Brand, who I started with, was a really important early articulator of this idea that computers are tools that you can use for transformation, for both for personal empowerment and for collective empowerment and social cohesion and onward and upward and up and to the right. And so by the late 70s, you have this personal computing and networking movement is transforming into an industry. and the guys with the beards and the long hair are putting on their ties, just like Steve Jobs does in this picture. I love this picture of him. And what is Apple, Apple selling? One of the reasons Apple was so successful is that it's selling this not just a computer, but if any of you are familiar with the early Apple advertising, it's widely, you can go on the internet and Google it. It's really kind of fun to look at these old ads. It's selling independence and creativity and empowerment through this machine. And while these machines initially aren't necessarily networked and they aren't connected to the internet for another 12 years or so, personal computing kind of really transforms the nature of computing itself. It's no longer this remote mainframe that's controlled by some faceless bureaucracy. It's now something where you have this power in your hands. It's the first step to, again, a gate. It becomes this entry point for a new way of thinking about digital communication and digital existing and improving oneself by having this tool. Jobs always referred to it as a computer is like a bicycle for the mind, which is a wonderful analogy, right? You're sort of thinking about how, a bicycle, if you're riding your bike across campus, you're powering it, you're making it go, but you're going so much faster than you could go if you were just walking. And the same thing with the computer. This is what Jobs would say kind of again and again in his, pitches in the late 70s and early 80s. This is what a computer is. It takes, and what a beautiful analogy for people who are not technical people to understand what a personal computer could do. And there's a lot of very optimistic ideas that are flowing through, particularly through the Northern California tech community, the Silicon Valley tech community, at this moment, at the sort of personal computer as it's bursting onto the scene as a consumer product that non-technical people are using. And this is a clip from InfoWorld, which is kind of a Silicon Valley based industry newspaper. The personal computer represents the last chance for that relic of the American Revolution, our continent's major contribution to human civilization, the entrepreneur. The personal computer operator is the electronic man on horseback riding into the sinking Western sun. He is the last of the rugged individualists, and the personal computer is his only effective weapon. So let's think about this. So let's go back to the history I just told you. So why do we have personal computers? Well, we have personal computers thanks to these idealists and entrepreneurs and people like Jobs and people like Stuart Brand and that are kind of creating this, taking this technology and making it something that's widely accessible. But behind them, we have this huge flow of money coming from the military industrial complex for advanced electronics and communication devices. Like, why do we have so many advances in silicon semiconductor technology from the 1950s to the 1970s and beyond? It's federal money coming into universities, going into sort of for defense contracting. It's NASA sending astronauts to the moon, and what they need is integrated circuits in those Apollo rockets. So there's this, even by 1980, we're only 23 years removed from Dwight Eisenhower and his missile cone. But already this kind of dissociation from that institutional past is already becoming fully born, that the computer industry and the internet industry that comes from it is very much kind of presenting itself in opposition to regulation, in opposition. It's something that's entirely different, that this also kind of going back to the roots. A lot of these personal computer evangelists, entrepreneurs talk about frontiers and being pioneers and these kind of old West, cowboys. That is something that the tech industry still continues to embrace today, as problematic as the notion of the frontier is, and this idea of kind of an open, empty space uninhabited by people in the West, which, as we well know, that was not exactly how Manifest Destiny happened. The settlement of the North American continent didn't happen quite that way. So, but this is, I think this is really important in understanding kind of how we get to what the internet economy becomes and how it's kind of contained or not contained. So by the 1980s, the ARPANET has kind of turned into the NSF Net. You guys know the NSF, National Science Foundation. It's still government controlled, but it's moving from the Pentagon to something that is more broadly accessible to more researchers who aren't necessarily connected to DARPA in any way. So it's opening, it's still a walled garden, but it's opening up. By the end of the 1980s, the NSF Net, you can have, commercial entities can have a .com domain, but they can have a website. You could be Xerox.com or IBM.com or whatever. You can have a website, but you cannot sell anything on the internet. This was a really important distinction. No one could make money on the internet. So what happens at the beginning of the 90s is that Washington, D.C. policymakers start setting to two things. One is to increasing the capacity of the NSF Net to process more data because the computers are getting more powerful, and also to start advancing the commercialization of that backbone, finding ways to sort of use the backbone, not just for governmental purposes, but for commercial purposes. And this is, it's the end of the Cold War. It's, the original imperatives, the rationale for having this network kind of being government controlled and are slipping away. It's the end of the Reagan-Bush era that had been one of deregulation and putting the private sector forward rather than and the public sector stepping back. So it's all in key with kind of the politics of the moment. And that's a really important thing to think about when we're thinking about the internet economy. It's responding to the politics of the moment, wherever you are. Like what's happening right now in 2021 is responding to politics of the moment. In 1989, same thing. The other thing that's really important that helps us understand why Washington, D.C. lawmakers are doing what they're doing is Japan. So from the 1970s and 1980s, the main economic anxiety of the US is competition from Japan, and especially in the electronics industry, where Japanese hardware manufacturers, particularly semiconductor manufacturers, are just eating the US's lunch. And they're doing this through heavily subsidized industries that are, able to develop really advanced technologies and flood the market and undercut American manufacturers on price. So the anxiety about what Japan is doing is driving a lot of what Washington is worried about in the late 80s. Now, this is going to change by the mid 90s because the Japanese economic miracle fades. And so the desire to imitate everything Japan's doing kind of fades away with that. But that is a big, understanding why DC is spending money. Same thing now, 2021, China is a big driver. So this is a similar, there's competition and a real worry that the US is going to slip behind, as the car industry has already been decimated by Japan. And so will electronics be next? And so Washington starts, and both private companies and DC lawmakers start putting a lot of money into supercomputing and getting to even more powerful computers, because that's something Japan's doing starting in the mid 70s into the 80s. There's a very robust supercomputing program. And so this is really kind of responding to what's going on, not just technologically possible, but Washington, D.C. is putting money in, just like Eisenhower put money into microelectronics after Sputnik. The same thing's happening in the late 80s, early 90s with supercomputing. Well, if you have really powerful computers, right, and you want those, if the purpose of the internet is to allow these supercomputers to talk to one another, you're going to need a more powerful internet. So enter my man, Al Gore. All right, so some of you may remember Al Gore. He may be a historical figure to many of you guys, but he was vice president from 92 to 2000. He was Bill Clinton's vice president. Incidentally, I actually worked for Al Gore for a couple of years when I was in my 20s, so I can talk more in the Q&A about what I did for and didn't do for Al Gore. But Al Gore was a senator from Tennessee and was a real cheerleader champion, early adopter of technology. The guy had a laptop when it was a 30-pound giant thing. The guy he was the first person to buy everything. And he was very interested and keyed into this debate over supercomputing. And he while he later got a lot of heat for allegedly claiming, which he didn't really claim, that he invented the internet. He didn't claim that, but nonetheless, he kind of got slammed for like, Al Gore said he invented the internet. He didn't. But what he did do was he co-sponsored the Supercomputing Act of 1991, which, among other things, not only gave money for these supercomputers, but also put a lot of money into making the internet heftier and allowing so you could have more data flowing through it. So had that not happened, we really couldn't have commercialized the internet. The US, it just would not have been robust enough to do it. So there's a really important political dimension here that is, and to again understand this, these are the technologists are playing a major role, but also lawmakers are making things possible in many ways. And it wasn't just Al Gore. I think another early adopter, big champion, technologist, technophile was Newt Gingrich, who was on the opposite side of the political spectrum from Gore, conservative Republican. You guys may be familiar with him now as a sort of strong Trump ally and surrogate, but back in the 80s, he was a congressman from Georgia, and then he later became Speaker of the House in the 1990s. And I bring him and Gore up because what's important here is that these two guys who were really unusual in the 80s in being lawmakers in Congress who were really down with, who really understood the technology to the degree that lawmakers can, they become incredibly powerful and consequential lawmakers in the 90s, vice president and Speaker of the House. So they're kind of advancing, they're kind of shepherding these policies and programs in a way that that others who might not have understood what the potential was of the internet might have slept on. So these two, by the time that Gore is vice president and Gingrich is about to become Speaker of the House, you're seeing the commercialization of the internet that starts in the 1991, where it gets opened up, bearing fruit. You have the Mosaic browser developed at the University of Illinois, one of those supercomputing centers that is commercialized as Netscape. Netscape becomes the first big .com IPO. And so the internet economy starts galloping along in the mid-90s. And so the question starts coming, okay, so what does DC do about this new platform for commerce and communication? And the other thing that's happening at the same time, remember, politics is everything, is one of the first things that lawmakers are concerned about is what are the children going to see on the internet? So the early internet was, a lot of it was porn. That was one of the big growth industry in the early internet, for sure. And there were no limits on what children should see. This is a time to, if you guys remember, have heard of Al Gore's wife, Tipper. She was a big proponent of labels on music for explicit lyrics. Like when you see E for explicit on your Spotify, you can thank Tipper Gore. That was the beginning of that, labeling rock music and other music as having lyrics and themes that might be objectionable. So there's kind of the late 80s, early to mid 90s is a time when lawmakers are having a lot of debate over what sort of media, what sort of protections should be placed on media so children don't see the wrong thing or things that their parents might be upset by. So there's music, there's television. This is the beginning of the television rating system. You know, when you see like TVMA on your corner of your screen, that's also a result of this. And now we have this wild new world of the internet. And so what children might see is driving a lot of lawmakers' anxiety. So this is why when the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which is really the reform that makes the internet economy possible, it contains within it another piece of legislation called the Communications Decency Act. Why is it called that? Because it's all about the kiddies watching the porn on the internet. That's what the lawmakers of both parties were concerned about. And within that part of the law, there was this section 230. You may have heard of section 230. This is a provision that holds platforms harmless for what third parties might say on their platform. It also holds them harmless if they decide to take something off. They're not going to be, if they decide to censor something or remove something from their platform, they have the power to do that. So it's kind of what it basically is it is the ultimate self-regulation. In the debate leading up to the 1996 Telecom Reform Act, internet companies, these providers, these ISPs, these internet, again, very, very young, newly commercialized platforms are coming to Gore and Gingrich and Clinton and saying, don't regulate us, protect us from the big telecoms. They're the ones that are the big Goliaths here. We're the young industries that need to be free. Our information needs to be free. You can't put limits on what can be said. Don't get freaked out about porn and say, put these sort of strict censorship rules on the internet. Instead, trust us and let us regulate ourselves. That's what Section 230 is all about. It's letting the companies regulate themselves and not holding them, making sure they can't be sued if someone gets mad that their posts get taken down, and also keeping them harmless, allowing information to be free, allowing people to say whatever they want on the internet because it was new, because it was growing, because there was so much potential. So this is, and let's keep in mind that this is the 1996, what the internet was. The platforms that are, again, there was no social media. Mark Zuckerberg was in 6th grade. Google was 2 years away from being created. CompuServe and Prodigy, which many of you have probably never heard of, which were essentially born as time-sharing networks. Those are the ones that are the kind of impetus for Section 230. The world of the internet was so wildly different than it is now. And but the politics of the 90s and the sort of state of the art, the state of the tech, the state of the business, and the state of politics helps us understand why we get the internet economy we have now. So by the time you get to the late 90s, the internet has been, I don't know if it's been cleaned up, but it is being heralded as this way that kids and everyone else can surf their way to knowledge and enlightenment, right? That connecting everyone is a way to make the world a better place. And this is taking the ideas of the early 70s that all those long-haired, well-meaning hippies in Berkeley were, animated by, and sort of scaling them up. And the people building these companies are people who are of that generation and informed by those ideals and those hopes and that real optimism about the power of technology to make the world better, to overcome our differences, that more connectivity is better, and good, more free information. The more free the information is, the better it is. And so this, as we move forward through time to Facebook and mobile technology, and then the cloud, everything has scaled up to other heights unimagined in 1996, much less in 1972 or 1957. But the internet economy has grown so large in part because it has been so unregulated or lightly regulated. It has allowed it to scale. And now the debate is how, what do we do with the internet economy as it is now? What do we do with, should information really be free? Or should we think about this question of free more in context? And who should be the purveyors and the platforms of that information? And one of the most important things to start that conversation and get where we need to go is to remember the history. History is misremembered wildly. This is a Post-it note on a staircase in Facebook. This is like almost 10 years old, but I love this picture. Hey, Silicon Valley, thanks for inventing the internet. Okay, Silicon Valley didn't invent the internet. It has a much longer history. And if we need to understand that longer history, and particularly the history of government involvement, to have a really measured and smart conversation about where the internet economy might go next. So I will leave it there. And if you are interested in what I had to say and would like to see more of it, this is the cover of my book, which is now in paperback, which is a history of Silicon Valley since the 1940s up until pretty much now, and is a bigger picture story of what I've just talked about today. But I will leave it there and I will stop sharing, and I'm excited to have a conversation about this.
feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions, or post in the chat and I can read those out as well.
Do you have questions on what sort of regulation would make sense today, to replace Section 230?
That's a great question. It makes me really glad that I'm not I'm not working on Capitol Hill and have to come up with those answers. I think, the sticky thing is that the replacing 230, 230 is a kind of, it's the glue holding this loose basket together, and you don't want to sort of have unintended consequences of messing things up. I think that one of the things that, rather than I'm very disquieted by, I think we should not rush to say, well, we should have some sort of government entity that is, dictating what can and, what's misinformation and what's good information, just simply because it just depends on who, that can be dangerous too. And I wish I had kind of a nice, crisp, oh yes, this is what, I think one of the reasons this is so difficult to solve is because it is really complicated. It's a matter of, I think there's ways that you could make it more, give companies more liability for, or create sticks that dissuade algorithmic amplification, which is part of the problem. That isn't the only solution. I think data privacy and kind of going to default is sort of a more European model default. Data privacy is the default, and openness is something that you choose in the design of these platforms would be extremely helpful. The problematic thing is that every single one of these fixes is going to be something that dents profits and shareholder value for these publicly traded companies, and all of these companies are now among the biggest spending lobbyists in DC, that they would like the regulations to be shaped to their to what they need. And there's also an offshoot of, if you do put too many tough rules on, you have now you could make something so a Facebook, which has the resources to adjust and respond to more strict data privacy rules or product design rules, would still have an advantage, and smaller entrants wouldn't. So I think there's sort of a multi-part way to address it that has to do with the way with platform design, with incentives, with use of user data, and then also, with the end goal being, I think for all of this, is to create oxygen for new entrants to come into the marketplace. Is a real, and antitrust can take a lot of different forms, and do both break up companies is one, but more often what the US has done is put guardrails on companies and forced sharing of data, sharing of intellectual property to a certain degree, and created space for new companies and new competitors to emerge, or new technologies to emerge that can be competitor technologies. That's another piece of the problem.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed when you were talking about the NSF Net in the late 80s that the upper Midwest and the Southeast were kind of left out of the picture. Was that arbitrary politics?
It had to do with, well, it's always, politics is always there, but it had to do with kind of where the powerhouse sort of supercomputing centers were too, or so the universities that had the resources, or the federal research centers. The Southeast is strange because, but I think that's a reflection of the universities, like where who has capacity, but also in a way is a departure from its defense roots, where if you look at the patterns of defense spending for pure defense spending and defense contracting, so much money flows to places like Georgia and Florida. That's where all these big bases are. So I think partially it's showing this, when you transition away from a defense-centric network, to one that is more broad-based and looking at NSF-funded supercomputing centers. You have a whole region of the country where a lot of so much of the technological capacity building has been hinged and hitched to defense. And continues to be. I was just in Tampa last week and giving a talk, and it was really interesting sort of seeing how much, because CENTCOM's there, and it's a very, defense technology is still, as you know, a big driver of what's happening there in the tech sector generally, and for good reason. But that's I think a real challenge. It's both, it's been harder to sort of do pure commercial plays apart from that.
In the upper Midwest?
The upper Midwest is, that is curious, because you have, Wisconsin, you have Minnesota, you have places, I don't know if I have a great answer for that.
Well, thank you. That's
Yeah.
insightful. Other questions from our audience? Do you have a feel for what our next big challenge is with the internet economy?
I do. I mean, I see Bowen's raised his hand too.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, just have a few questions about it. Since this kind of talks about the economy, internet economy. So, what do you think is the most critical issue of the current internet economy? Is it centralization, or can you be more specific about it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think actually this is related to Janice's questions too. So that's a great question. I think centralization is a big problem. There's both centralization and then there's sort of siloing within the centralization, right? Wouldn't it be nice to have a universal login to all these things, or this sort of entry point where and interoperability and portability of data? Wouldn't that be nice? But I think the real challenge is what's the, is the making money on the internet in a way that doesn't have downstream effects problem. So look, the ad-based model that is the Google/Meta model of a free, quote unquote, free service that sells user data to, sells ads against user data, has been the way that was this incredibly, initially beautifully elegant solution to the torrent of pop-up ads and banner ads and the hellscape that was, us going to most search engines in like 1999 or 2000. So embedding making those ads essentially disappear and making the user the product was a very, very effective way to make money on the internet. So that's incredibly effective and obviously has all sorts of data privacy implications. And then the other way is subscription. So you have a paywall, right? So I'm sure many of us in the last, 2-3 days, there's been some article you saw a link to, and you're like, oh, I want to read that. And you go and you're like, I have to subscribe to Bloomberg, or I have to do it so paywall is the other way to make money on the internet. And that's not a really information should be free, model. I think the big challenge is, okay, so what's option 3? If ads are one, and we see all the downstream effects of that, but it has been very open, and it's allowed all this sort of collaboration and communication and create, a lot of positive outcomes as well as negative ones. And subscription is another, but that has its downsides too. It requires, it isn't as egalitarian, it's stratified by class, it's kind of, it could keep people in their own sort of familiar tracks of where they get the information. So what's option 3? I don't know what that option 3 is, but I'm super curious about it. And it's been my pet question I've been asking everyone. So I would love to know if anyone has thoughts on because let's face it, if you go to some of the original internet, thinkers, they're still like, we just need to get back to basics and fundamentals and make this, and this was designed as a non-commercial space, and we need to find a way to make it effectively non-commercial again. And that's nice. But I don't think that that's going to happen. I think it's the scale is too big. Do we necessarily want to govern? I mean, there's the public utility model that could be a regulatory model, like AT&T was regulated, Mobile was regulated by the US government for a long time. But there isn't, to just say, forget it, let's stop making this a capitalist enterprise. Like, I think that's a little idealistic. As much as that sounds wonderful, I don't see how that quite works. Yeah. Thanks for that question. It's a good question.
Yeah, it's great information for me because I'm working on this problem too.
Oh, good. All right. Well, I look forward to your option 3.
I'm just trying. Maybe hopefully bear some fruits. Thank you.
Just a note on that. I'm not trying to advocate for it, but the Brave browser, the internet browser, they have an interesting take on it. They're trying to monetize like attention, basically. If you're spending time on a site, if they're part of the program, they pay the site in a cryptocurrency essentially. And it is, I'm not too deep into it, but it's an interesting concept, and I think gets to an alternative, that number 3 that you're discussing. So
Interesting. Thanks for that.
We have a question on the chat as well. I think from Minas, I'm sorry if I pronounce your name wrong, that asks, you discussed this from a US viewpoint. However, in reality, the internet has now become a force for free speech in the world and perhaps a lifeline for freedom. What or how does this enter into the regulation issue?
Thank you for asking that. I think that's an absolutely critical question. And it's something I'm thinking about a lot too. Look, this was of so much an American creation. This whole, like, this regulatory regime that sort of constrained and created and enabled the platforms we have. The people who are building it are not just American, but by and large, American or naturalized Americans living on the West Coast of the United States in 2 very prosperous metro areas, college educated. Like, we're a pretty narrow band of the global population. And as much as one wants to approach product design as, with as open a mind as possible, we all bring our own biases and limitations to the table when you have a very kind of limited world. I'm both, it's, such a gut punch just in the last, obviously all the Facebook papers that have come out in the last couple of weeks, but one of those, among those, the kind of the data on, you have the vast majority of Facebook's user base is outside the United States. And just kind of less than 10% of their enforcement resources or content moderation resources are devoted to non-English speaking parts of the world. And in India, you have only 5 of the 20 something commonly used languages. Only 5 of them have anyone on the Facebook team with knowledge of those languages that are doing any sort of moderation. That is extraordinarily problematic. And I think this is, again, kind of this head exploding dimension of the internet economy that is so different from other examples of business regulation in the past. So say Ford Motor Company, American company, right? Sold cars all over the world. But you had to, Ford would develop a different model to be sold in European countries that had different fuel standards, right? Or tailor it for different markets. You would have just, you had an ability with these physical goods to, and nation states had an ability to gatekeep, to say, I'm sorry, we don't import cars that don't have fuel standards of X. Those aren't allowed to drive on our roads. You cannot, here you have this unbounded service that is not contained by national or continental borders. And it has been aggressively marketed, and, the non-US, Facebook's a glaring example, but it's not the only, to non-US users and I think the other thing that I think is really frustrating to me, and again, I wish I had a lovely, neat answer, but this is more observational, which is that although politics has always been absolutely critical to the development of the internet economy, it's always had to do with kind of retail politics and American politics, that the builders of that economy have been kind of sometimes willfully and proudly inattentive or ignorant to political dynamics, both not only in the US, but especially in the world. That you have these tools, these platforms, again, animated by this really, like, wouldn't it be great if this were true? Wouldn't it be great if we put a computer on every desk and we connected everyone, that all of the thorny problems of discrimination and inequity and inequality would just vanish because we'd all find this level playing field on which to communicate. We now have abundant evidence that that is not the case. But the problem is that optimistic, earnest, technocentric vision and this sort of magical thinking that there is, with the best technology, we're going to be able to overcome these differences, that has informed the design of products that were sort of aggressively marketed to and very quickly sort of rapidly grew in these overseas markets without thought to the downstream consequences or enough knowledge of the territories and the histories of the places that they were going into. Again, a kind of very privileged, narrow band of, again, people who meant well. I don't subscribe to the, these are evil tech overlords and they're just, they've intended on this all along. Look, I've studied these people for 20 some years. I mean, I've been doing this stuff since Mark Zuckerberg was in middle school. And I can tell you that it was, this is something of a runaway train. This is not to excuse them, but this is also to say that this was, these were designed for one thing and they've become something entirely different. And going global has been extraordinarily problematic.
Thank you for that. Denise, do you have a question?
I do, but I want to make sure to give an opportunity for students to ask first. There they are.
Michael,
I'll wait.
I guess Trent, you can go ahead, and then Michael, if that's okay.
Hi,
Hi.
thanks, I appreciate that. I just wanted to build off that question of the runaway train, because that's something I've been thinking too, these inventors that maybe, like you said, they didn't have ill will, but at the same time, maybe they didn't fully flesh out the implications of what was being created at the time. And having studied this invention of the internet, I'm curious, like, what are your recommendations for, future avoidance of this runaway train, where we're developing something that we're not really sure what the future implications are? How can we be confident that it won't, that it'll build the best societal implications, I guess?
Yeah. Well, take more history classes. No, but that isn't only it. But I do think I think it has to do with that. Look, engineering thinking is extraordinarily, it's sort of extraordinary. It's amazing. I think we need to acknowledge kind of the sort of heads down focus on building extraordinary technology and almost to the exclusion of focusing on anything much else has resulted in extraordinary sort of leapfrog examples. I mean, my watch that, was trying to talk to me while I was giving my presentation, like, this has more computing power than the Apollo program. Like, it's crazy what has been accomplished. But at the same time, I think once you get to scale and once computer hardware and software has sort of gone into realms that it didn't used to disrupt or occupy, I mean, up until, through the 20th century, these were mostly, office tools, right? They were disrupting secretaries. They were disrupting, how you do workflow in the office. It was kind of limited. And now, particularly in the last 20 years, we've had, disrupting, taxis and disrupting politics and disrupting and becoming political town squares, I think is particularly relevant. So in thinking about, where we go from here, I think one is to recognize this is a very, very different world than it was 25 years ago, or even 10 years ago. and to have more people in the room, the kind of not just engineers, it's like engineers and it's a yes and have a sort of both have perspectives, sort of people who are the designers and builders, having this a more robust sense of all the other, you know, of the things they need to keep in mind. But I also think it's a little unfair to be like, oh, technologists just need to take ethics courses and history courses and have all these things in mind while they're building something. Well, it's kind of hard to, in a way, it's a team sport. You need to have a lot of different perspectives in the room. I think having social scientists, you know, there were a lot of social scientists who were pointing out tech critiques, making tech critiques long before it became fashionable. They were, you know, in a way, kind of howling into the void a little bit. 15 years ago, you know, you have some really, you know, really important work that was done that's sort of pointing out the flaws in these models. And I think bringing those voices into the room. And I think having, when we think about going back to what I was saying earlier about the sort of US built and global with a global impact, I think you know, US companies just have to really radically rethink the build at the root, kind of who's your market. And if you're a global market, like you must think sort of in radically different ways about who, you know, how this may land, and have a much broader sociocultural awareness. I will say, I think that the technologists of this generation, like you guys, are coming into this with a conscientiousness and a consciousness that even 10 or 15 years ago, people didn't have, because they weren't given that, or kind of, I think the way that the state of the industry and the state of the public conversation around particularly software platforms has sort of changed the way that people understand themselves and their own responsibility for what they build. So I'm hopeful. I think I'm betting long on Gen Z.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Do you see like one entity as the driver behind kind of innovation in the internet economy, like the, you know, defense funding of the 60s, or is it much more dispersed? Or if there is still one, what is it?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting. I see multiple nodes. And so one of them is defense. You know, one sort of interesting thing that's happened in the last decade is a kind of resurgence. I mean, the Pentagon never went away, to be clear. It's like always been a very big funder and a big contractor. But starting around 2015, when Ash Carter was Secretary of DoD, this is during the Obama administration, he sort of made a very conscious push to go to Silicon Valley and to partner with Silicon Valley companies in kind of bringing the best technology of the Valley to modernize the Pentagon. And so this has manifested itself in a lot of things. It was the origins of the Maven project at Google, which was the subject of this big protest among employees, the first kind of big Google protest that resulted in Sundar Pichai sort of stepping back and being like, no, we're not going to do that. Although there's still ties to the defense industry across many companies, and so that there's, and you see with cloud, Amazon, Microsoft, you know, there's federal business and defense business is a big piece of that. So I think the Pentagon and the federal government generally, like right now, we'll see what sort of bills actually get passed in Washington, but the infrastructure bill includes big chunks of money for innovation centers, regional innovation centers and other places that will be generative. Like if it comes through, it's not nothing. And so there's a new kind of federal commitment to spending money on this stuff, and infrastructure itself and green infrastructure will be, you know, if it's at scale, will be a generator. So I actually am a big champion of sort of seeing how much the military industrial complex ceded. I would love for the US to get into that business again, not for reasons of war, but for reasons of sort of an energy transition and thinking about climate as a geopolitical threat, which is the way that governments spend money, but really framing that as, you know, and making that a priority. I'm not entirely sure the politics are going to let that pass. But the other power centers are the big platform companies themselves, which have big research operations that are, to be clear, only a fraction of what the NSF continues to spend. So they're not, the biggest players, but they're very big players. And they are kind of taking it upon themselves to, try to make new rules and set the direction. And they're sort of gobbling up talent. I think, people like you guys, going and working in industry is a big, that's making these big companies a powerhouse and consequential and kind of shaping where computing's going next.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions from the audience? Okay. Now, Denise, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I'm glad I'm not the only one with a barking dog in the background.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. So this is a tangential question. My first question is, it seems that engineers are expected to pick up the ethics and the social science and the philosophy and try in developing technology. And you've already commented on that it seems a little unrealistic. But the bias, the expectation doesn't go the other way. So the social scientists, the ethics, people who have expertise in ethics are not expected to pick up the technology. And you clearly have. At least you picked up the lingo enough to take a deeper dive into it. And I think we could get a lot farther if we broke down those barriers, if people would come into our sandbox, and I'm talking we as engineers. Do you have I know there's I don't do math bias, but do you have some comments on, yeah, I hear that way too often. Like, well, if you don't do it, I'm not going to do it for you. So what do we do now?
Yeah.
Anyway, that's kind of unsympathetic, and I wouldn't do that as a teacher. But can you comment on that bias? It really drives me crazy. I think people would be much better able to help us direct our technology to the right problems in the right ways from the outset if they were able to come more into the sandbox, the engineering sandbox.
I really like that idea, and I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I've been on a 2+ decade quest to learn the lingo and to grasp the fundamentals, and I'm still, and look, I'm not a math person particularly, but I think it's possible. And I think there's I think you're right. I think there's too much the kind of engineers have it wrong. They need more, go take philosophy, rather than there's this sort of oppositional fear. And I think part of it comes from this sort of reactive feeling like engineers have all the power and the humanists and the social scientists have sort of been pushed to one side. And so there's this defensiveness, which is unfair. And I think that's inaccurate. I think, yes, there's been sort of lots of public la and championing of, STEM. And we sort of see it percolate through the kind of the politics and power of different units at the university. But I think there needs to be there must be a much more well-trod path between departments like mine and departments like yours. And that even people who aren't kind of like me, like I'm studying the history of computing, even people who are sort of studying the history of other things need to understand what's going on. And it's one reason I'm a political historian. That's my roots. Like, I worked in politics. When I worked for Al Gore, I actually didn't work on technology policy, believe it or not. I worked on urban economic development policy and social policy and healthcare. Totally different things. I remember now with some embarrassment that I was actually sitting in my office in the White House executive office building, which is across the street from the West Wing, and looking out the door and seeing all these dudes in blue shirts and khakis, kind of nerdy, walking down the hallway. And I'm like, oh, vice president's meeting with those Silicon Valley people again. What are they doing? And then I go back, 20 some years later, I'm like, oh yeah, they were kind of building the internet economy. I was sitting there busily doing my talking points for a trip to Cleveland. Like, I was, completely oblivious at the importance of what was happening. And I think there's too much of that the attitude of kind of circa 1995 me. There's too much of that still circulates in kind of social scientific and policymaking circles today. And now it's become easy to be like, oh, these big bad technologists, they don't get it. And no, I agree. I think it needs to be a two-way street. And this internet economy is the economy. And so you do need to have people back and forth. I'm not really sure. I think there's curricular implications that are not just, oh, technologists take a, tech ethics course, but that social scientists and humanists take a technology, sort of understand the fundamentals of engineering, like get to know what's going on.
Well, I think we've shut people out, not intentionally so much, but by the fact that the field that we're all invested in, the engineers in the room, takes a lot of prerequisite knowledge to build up certain capability, and that keeps people, undergraduates especially, from other majors out. And I think that is something we need to change. We're too siloed at the undergraduate level. And it's a basic knowledge challenge. All that knowledge you need to build up to grasp some of these things, but I think there are other pathways to getting there. So thank you for the insight.
Yeah.
There are other questions. So thank you again.
Yeah.
All right, Cecilia, and then Alice, if you can go ahead and ask your questions.
Yeah, hi, thank you for a really interesting talk. As someone who lived through a lot of that as a early computer scientist back in the day in Silicon Valley in the 80s, it was really interesting to see your summary of this. But what I'm wondering is, what do you believe? I mean, so much of what we see about Silicon Valley, about the internet today, is based on the myth of the lone male inventor. Whereas really so many of these projects were collaborative. I mean, so you mentioned, social scientists were talking, we're making comments. I mean, back in 2004, I remember I published a paper advocating that every, data science project should have a triumvirate, right? A domain scientist, a computer scientist, and a social scientist in a position of power. And, and these sort of collaborations still don't get press. They don't get attention. And yet I think this is really what we need going forward, right? So what would you have to say about that? And what can we do to publicize, these collaborations and allow maybe underrepresented voices like people of color and women to have more say in these domains? Yeah.
I wholeheartedly endorse your proposal. I sign on to it. And yeah, the reality is that this is been a team endeavor since the very beginning. And also, by the way, that people are like, well, why does Silicon Valley have no women? I'm like, excuse me, it's full of them always. Like from the very beginning, they just weren't getting the stock options or the magazine covers or the glory. And some of the women who were integral to the initial success of Silicon Valley were stay-at-home spouses of the guys who were working all the time building microprocessors. So it's a real, just acknowledging that history is one, and also not acknowledging, why, for example, was Apple successful as one of, many, many other personal computer, garage-based personal computer operations. It's because they hired on, Mike Markkula, who was an operations guy, not countercultural, not anything, like a guy who knew how to run companies and scale them. And they hired really good marketing people, and they actually had a whole team. Their VP of marketing was a woman, and they had all these, they got people, they had this whole team. It wasn't like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, building his stuff, and Steve Jobs being like, I'm vision guy. Yeah, that was super important, but you had this whole infrastructure behind them. And pick out any single company, and that's what it is. And when you look at technical teams, it's always teams. It's not like one guy. Like Thomas Edison wasn't even one guy. He had a lab. And so but we love the rugged individualists. We love the lone inventor. We love the cowboys. Hell, even cowboys weren't solo acts. They were cowboys, plural, like the only way and they were more diverse, actually. They were Latino, they were Black, so it's just this, it's very hard because the grain runs deep. It's goes back, look, we're a country that was founded on overthrowing a king, and, everyone has their own plot of land, and, but I think the more we talk about the history and the more we talk about teams, and the more that teams are multidisciplinary and diverse on multiple dimensions. And look, it's good for business. It's good for business. Like, how many product ideas didn't even get airtime because you had a monochromatic team in the room? And monochromatic, not in many ways, right? Disciplinary background, gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, class, a whole host of things, right? That make us all different and contribute in different ways. I guess my solution is I'm just gonna bang the drum as often and as loudly as I can and hope that somebody listens.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Allison, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So I don't know if there's a lot of Gen Z left in the room, but I think you touched on having a lot of hope for Gen Z. And this is kind of like an out there question, but I just wanted to ask, like, what are your wildest hopes and dreams for Gen Z? Like, we all join startups or join our social medias, or even bigger than that. Like, what could you see?
I think, there are obviously a lot of parallels between Gen Z and the baby boom in terms of coming of age at a time of incredible turmoil, and where it's sort of the fundamentals of American society and global society in many places are kind of up for debate, and where institutions have failed to keep up or failed to properly address. So I think that there's a lot of different paths that come out of that. Look, I think there's probably problematic things that came out of baby boom idealism, but what baby boomers did is, among other things, sort of a good chunk of the technologists turned away from the military industrial complex because they're like, I don't want to go work for Lockheed. I don't want to work for the Defense Department. How can I get a job out of college that has nothing to do with the Vietnam War at all? And so what did they do? They went to Xerox PARC. They went to labs that weren't doing defense work. They started homebrew, they started cooking up motherboards in their garages, and then went to the homebrew computer club. So they kind of generated this entirely new industry, which, again, had its blind spots and its missing pieces. I think Gen Z is different from that baby boom generation in that it's coming of age in a era of increased egalitarianism and more awareness of gender, race, class inequality, and for all of its flaws is more kind of socially just night and day, kind of in terms of where things were and where things are now. I'd love to see, first, I think that there are a number of dimensions. One is sort of thinking about what is the technology for. There's a frustration I have with, here's my frustration with the metaverse as defined by Meta, okay? And we may have different opinions about that. Well, first of all, I read Snow Crash. It's not a pretty picture. But also, I feel like so much of, that's one example of, so you have this freeway, and instead of saying, you kind of add another lane to the freeway rather than, oh, what if we had everyone ride light rail? Not to, there's sort of this lack of imagination. And so my hopes for Gen Z are to kind of bring the broader social awareness that's tempered with a reality, and thinking about, how can you, I think we have a challenge of not necessarily doing away with capitalism, although there's some members of Gen Z who would like to, but reimagining it in a way that is more, that really is delivering on the promises of the baby boom generation that they really didn't quite get to. And I would love to see that. I would love to see what you guys create.
Thank you. We'll go go dream.
Go dream, go dream and do.
Any other questions from our audience? Okay, so Margaret, thank you for staying over and for answering all of our questions. You were really awesome. It's wonderful to see our students engaged and now dreaming per Alice. So, you know, very insightful, and I really appreciate the time that you've spent with our students today.
Yeah, happy to do it. Great to talk to you all. Stay in touch. And in the winter quarter, if any of you guys are interested, I'm teaching HistAA 317, History of the Digital Age, which some of you on this call are familiar with. And it's really a kind of, it's a history class, but it's looking at, you can look on my plan and see the description and see all about it. And it's also counts for the data science minor, as well as a history class. So if you're interested, sign up. I'd love to see you.